Hi, I'm Sharon Landon, and welcome to Old Asian Lady. My guest today is my brother, Jonathan Landon. He is a veteran and a retired Army chaplain. It's amazing how much we don't know about our siblings, and this was a great way to learn. We covered topics like my adoption, life as a military brat, his decisions leading to joining the U.S. Army and being a chaplain, and also his service in the Middle East. Having been a military brat, I have to say that life is not easy for military families serving in any country. So here's a shout out from Old Asian Lady. Thanks to all of you for your service.
Thank you, Jonathan, for coming to talk to me today.
So glad to be here.
I've never really talked to you about it, and it's dealing with my adoption. And I guess at this time in my life, I'm kind of more understanding a little bit of myself. And one of the things that popped up, of course, is my adoption. And since we had never talked about it, and I thought it would be a really good time to see what you thought about all of a sudden having a couple of Asian siblings. What were your earliest memories about that?
Well, and actually, that's just I think important to bring out, and that is that there was no suddenly had Asian siblings thing to me. I wasn't even 2 when you were adopted. I have no memory of a time.
Really...
Yeah, I have no memory of a time when you and John were not my brother and sister. I also have no memory of a time I didn't know you were adopted. It was never one of these great, bolt from the blue. Oh my gosh, she's adopted. It's not like exactly it could be hidden, and so there was no great transition for me.
Okay. But, obviously, when you grew older, you noticed that we were different. So were there questions that you asked mom or dad about that?
I do remember several conversations with mom and dad about how the adoption came about and how mom and dad knew your parents in Taiwan. And hearing stories that would just come up about like when y'all would come over with your mom and play with Tom, who was old enough to do that at the time, and how Tom learned to speak Chinese really before he was fluent in English, because he had Chinese children to play with, and your natural mom would talk to him in Chinese, and our mom and dad didn't discourage that. So I remember all of those stories from very early childhood, and so having a sense that you had a family history that joined ours, not at the beginning of your life, but later in your life. That was something I was kind of aware of, that your family history and our family history, came together at some point in your life. That you had life experiences and family that I wasn't part of. It never bothered me. It was just it was just a background. It was an awareness and a background information. I guess little kids always expect that their older siblings had a life before they came along, right? And so to me, that was just part of that was your life before I came along, kind of. But I don't really remember, except for flashes. I don't remember anything before Maryland.
Oh, before Maryland, yeah. Because you were pretty young then, and we kind of moved around a lot. Even if when we were living in Japan, at that time you must have been 3 or 4, because I was in 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. So you don't remember too much of that. Yeah.
I remember I was in kindergarten. So I would have been 5. I turned 6 that summer that we arrived in Maryland. And I do remember, I do have some flashes of memory. I remember the library in Japan, going to the libraries of family for for the Saturday movie, the Saturday kids movies, and checking out a stack of books. I remember some flashes from kindergarten. I remember a scene. We were making piñatas one time in kindergarten out of paper mache. I also remember being the ship, because we took the cruise ship from Japan to California and then flew from California to Maryland. When we got to Maryland, we were in a very rural area of Maryland. Where we were living was a very rural area, and it wasn't near the base where Dad worked. And you were like the only Asians in the town at all. And that didn't really bother me at all. I don't think I've even really computed as being significant, except that John was getting ragged on and bullied at school because of being like the only Asian in his school. And I remember that, and Mom like tells stories about it too. He was complaining about it, and she's taught him. She's like, dude, you know, you're brown belt in judo. These kids don't know anything about how to fight. She says, so let me take you and show you what you can do to win a fight that they'll never want to have again. And she taught him how to fight dirty and seriously hurt them. And so you were interviewing Caroline. I'm like, oh, that sounds familiar. But here's the thing. So after she taught him that, and she taught him, he looked at her and he was a little older than Caroline was, but when, you know, in that story, and he looked at her and he said, you know, I could really seriously hurt these kids, couldn't I? Your mom's like, yeah, you seriously could. You're stronger, you're more athletic, and you know what you're doing, unlike them. They don't know how to fight. And he said, it's really not worth it, is it? And Mom said, well, no, it's really not, but that's going to be up to you to make your decision. And he decided it was not worth it, and so he never had that fight, because it just wasn't worth the harm he could do to other people if he really cut loose. But then Mom took him into the school and did a judo exhibition, and the two of them threw each other around on the mats. And the students decided that they didn't want to mess with him.
Oh, wait a minute. So they had the exhibition where John threw Mom on the mat?
So I imagine it was very controlled movements, but yeah, they did an exhibition, and they did, you know, some significant judo moves involving showing him how to do the throws and falls and things like that. And then I was thinking suspicion that his teacher, who knew he was being bullied, took the time to point out to some of these kids that they really were taking their lives in their hands.
Right.
You know, but he never thought it was worth it. So he never did. He never hurt him.
For me, I never really had that much of a bullying thing. I don't know if it was because I was a girl or just because the people that I was around was a little bit older, because I am 2 years older than John. But the other only bullying I had was with one Black girl, and she had, you know, pushed me or said something to me, but I think I shoved her back or something. So she didn't ever really do it again. But for you, because we were in different schools too, you guys were in elementary school. So it wasn't like, you know, I was around you guys a lot for other people to see that we were Asian compared to you. But I do remember that, you know, because my last name was Landon, and when we used to have teacher parent conferences and Mom would show up, it'd be like, huh?
Yeah, exactly. Because they assumed that Dad had married an Asian woman because you had a European name.
Yeah.
They assumed that Dad had married an Asian woman, and that's where this Asian girl came from.
Yeah.
And here comes Mom, who's very not Asian.
Yeah. And it wasn't until we actually, like you said earlier, we moved to Hawaii, that we were around a lot of Asian peoples. I moved out when I was right after we had gotten there. So what's going around in you guys' life, I didn't really know too much about. But as a Caucasian, I mean, I wouldn't say that there was it shouldn't be anything, because in Hawaii there's a lot of Caucasians there. But in school, I mean, did you guys come up against anything, discrimination or, that type of thing?
Oh yeah,
Oh, really? I never knew
yes, we
that.
did. In high school in Hawaii, there was toward the end of the school year, very close to the end of the school year, there would be a Kill Haole Day. This is the other students somehow. Obviously, the administration never had such a thing, but never recognized such a thing. But yeah, there was a tradition that the Asian and Polynesian kids would harass. I mean, they didn't typically brutalize the Haole kids, the European looking kids, but they would harass and hassle them, and that did happen to me. And
Wow.
fortunately, Tom was trotting across the campus when it happened. He saw it happen and intervened, and that solved it. But so I wasn't physically attacked, but they certainly were threatening me.
Wow.
But of course, Tom, dude's huge. Even in high school, he was really big.
Yeah.
And he was heavy set then. He's not anymore. He's thin now, but he was heavy set then.
He was in
as well
wrestling
as
or
being very
something
tall.
at that time.
He took wrestling, and he wrestled unlimited weight class, which meant over 200 pounds. But he was right at the bottom of unlimited weight class.
Oh, okay.
So he was wrestling against kids that were much bigger than he.
In Hawaii, I felt really at home because I was part of the majority of people. Although I have to say that Caucasian as a whole in Hawaii is still the larger race. But if you now add all the other different Asian groups, which are Vietnamese, Thai, Korean, Chinese, Japanese, then Asians do surpass Caucasians there. But yeah, I had no idea that was happening to you. So how was it addressed? I mean, because it would be kind of, did mom do something like she did back in Maryland for John?
No, not that I recall. And like I said, it never came to a physical confrontation. There was just verbal bullying and threatening looking body language. But and I only specifically remember it happening once, that I was actually the target of it. There was always talk about it, about, Kill Haole Day was coming up. But I was actually only the target of it one time, and Tom intervened and chased them off. And they were like, "Oh no, we weren't going to do anything. We were just teasing you," and off they went. But there was like three of them, I think. There were three of them,
Right.
and they were seniors, and I couldn't have been more than a sophomore because Tom was there. He's 2 years older than me, so if he was on campus,
Yeah.
I couldn't have been more than a sophomore.
At least there's more awareness of it nowadays in schools, and
Oh yeah.
I don't know how that's going to ever.
Well, it'll never stop, but there's more awareness of it, and there's more focused response.
Living in Maryland, we mentioned Hawaii, Maryland. Of course, we were in Japan and stuff. How did you feel growing up as a military brat? Because we did move around a lot, and I think Maryland was the first time that we stayed anywhere for any length of time. How did you feel about that?
It was the only time that we stayed anywhere for a significant length of time, and it is still in my life the longest place I've ever lived in, the longest time I've ever lived in one house. Still,
Really?
well, yeah, because what happened? So I graduated from high school, joined the Army Reserve. I went away to training. I came home. I got married. I moved out of mom and dad's house when I got married. Becky and I had two different places to live while I was in college, and then I was off to active duty. So yeah, the longest I've ever lived in one house is 8 years. The longest I've ever lived in one town so far is 12. But we've had two different houses.
Yeah. Did it affect your thinking or your attitude, moving around or so much?
Yes, it did. When I was a kid, I thought it was cool. We had cultural exposure that other kids in my classes and so on didn't have, and that was, that was neat. And there were we had stories to share that were unique in their experiences, things like that. So to me, it was never a problem. Um, but I think deep down there was a sense of loss at not having a stable place. I had a family, and home was always wherever the family was. When I got married, then it was wherever Becky was. I don't think I ever really knew that I had that sense of loss until my father-in-law died. He died very suddenly in a tractor accident, flipped his tractor, um, and family went home for the funeral, and Becky stayed there. I was stationed in Colorado at the time, and I came back to Colorado. I had a marriage retreat to lead, so I couldn't extend my stay in Colorado. And on the way to the marriage retreat, I won't give you the whole story because it was a hellacious trip. But on the way to the marriage retreat, I heard a song. It's called "The House That Built Me." It's a country song. I heard it on the radio, and a woman who it's about a woman who returns to the house that her father built and that she grew up in. And she talks about her handprints are in the concrete on the porch, and her dog's buried under the tree in the yard. And she learned to play the guitar upstairs in the bedroom. And she had a sense of having lost her way. And so she
Oh,
went back,
wow.
and there's a completely different family there now. But she went back and she asked permission to come in
Mm-hmm.
and look around and reconnect with her sense of self. And I still choke up when I talk about this. I'm not a guy, I don't cry easily, but that one triggered me, and telling the
Mm-hmm.
story of it still does.
Mm.
Um, and at first I couldn't figure out why.
Yeah.
And then I
Yeah.
realized, well, I had just come back from Gino's funeral, and family had come in from all over the country to the funeral.
Mm.
John was in basic training, and my son John, not your brother, my son
Mm-hmm.
John was in basic training at the time. They gave him emergency leave, and Naomi and I came from Colorado. Denise flew in from Georgia, where she was in college. Um, but one of Becky's cousins that came out from California with her husband, and I mean, just family from all over the place came in to Gino and Artie's place. And it was very clear that to all of them, this was home. This was a place they all knew they could always come back to. And then when I heard that song, I didn't figure out until a little bit later why it triggered me so. But that was when I realized I had never had
Mm.
that place. And
Yeah.
to me, that was the biggest loss of military service.
I always had the thing of, oh yeah, what do they say, if home is where you hang your hat or something, which is what you mentioned. But sometimes I wonder because when I see people my age, um, they all go on class reunions, and it's just with kids that they grew up with. And I think for me, I've never had, because military kids, we moved around a lot, so we never really
Yeah.
had lasting friends and stuff. And even for people in Maryland, where
Mm-hmm.
we were there for
Yeah.
8 years. But it's not like I mean, I started there in my junior high school, so it's not like I grew up with these kids. So when people go on reunions and they have all these trips where everybody gets back together from, and that makes me think, like, wow, and missing that. And um, it's weird that you're just talking about it being emotional about home and stuff.
And that's the thing about that. But see, it's too late for me to ever have that now. You can't build something like that in your 50s that can be a place, that can be a place that you're always, that's your forever place. And my kids, and before I ever got a house that even had the potential to be a forever home for me, my kids were grown and gone. So I can't make a place like that for them either. And the other cost of military life is, where are my kids? Well, I've got the Gordons in Washington, Denise and John are in Georgia. My grandkids are in Georgia. Um, Naomi's here. She's about an hour away. But most, where do I get to see them? I do a weekly Zoom meeting. And sometimes the kids ring in, and sometimes they don't. And John and the kids, they get on, but it's almost bedtime. It's Sunday afternoon for me, and it's almost bedtime for them, so they can't stay long.
Yeah. So I guess that kind of, because we talk about
Hmm.
military life and that, the loss that you have or what we didn't have growing up. Um, because dad was in the
Hmm.
military, but what made you decide to go into the military yourself? Was there a particular reason or just
Yeah, well, it was a bunch of things that sort of came together. I mean, I always considered it a realistic possibility. I mean, people who have no experience of military life um, often will say, "Well, that life is just so different," and they've heard horror stories about how hard it is and all of that. Um, but I knew military life from at least the family member point of view, and it wasn't strange and weird and frightening to me. Mom and dad both served. Um, Mom's father, Grandpa Ray, served. Um, Pretty much all of her brothers served. Uncle Gary served, and so for me, it it wasn't like it was a burning passion to be in the military, but it was certainly a very natural thing to consider it a realistic career possibility. So
right?
I could look at it and I could see all the advantages: the educational assistance, the travel, the opportunity to live new and interesting places, the free job training, the fact that it can, once you decide you're done with it, you come out of it with experience and leadership qualities and training and all of that that'll help you get another job. And so all of that was just all realistic and practical. But then, so dad retired from the Navy in 83, late summer of 83, right before my
Hmm.
senior year started in high school, and didn't get a job until the next summer. And so we stayed in
Hmm.
Hawaii, and I finished out my high school, which was nice because I was the only one of us, of the four of us, I was the only one who made it all the way through high school in the same school, I think. No, you did too, I guess.
Junior high school, I was at Severna Park, and then my high school went to Chesapeake. Yeah.
So uh, after my senior year was complete in the summer of 84, dad moved to California and got a job. Mom and dad moved to California and got a job at the
Hmm.
Army Depot in Sacramento, and settled there. And if we were all kind of always sort of steeped, not even necessarily told, but just sort of steeped in the assumption we were going to go to college, right? And so I'm like, okay, well, I graduated from high school, time to start college. And that's when I discovered the concept of non-resident tuition. Because mom and dad were not California residents the preceding year. And so they would have made me pay non-resident tuition if I'd started college right away.
Oh, yeah.
So there was some fiddling around trying to figure out what to do. But essentially, what I decided to do was to say, you know what, let me go join the Army Reserve. And actually, I just joined the military, joined the reserve. I didn't set out specifically with Army in mind at first. So let me join the reserve and get my initial training done. And then, when I finish my initial training, I will have established California residency. Because no matter where you live, if the military sent you there, you can still maintain the state where you started as your residence if you wish. So I will have established California residency. I will have earned education benefits. I'll be paying resident tuition, and I'll have knocked out some free schooling because you get college credits for military training. And so I said, so let me just join the reserve and have some fun and get some money, and and then when all that's done, I'll be ready for college. So I went to the Navy recruiter first, and he said, "So what do I need to do to get you to enlist?" Okay, loyalty to dad, grew up a Navy kid. Let's try the Navy Reserve first. And I said, I want to go to the Defense Language Institute and study language. Because I had taken language in high school. I knew I enjoyed it, and in middle school. I knew I enjoyed it, and I figured I had the talent, much like Dad. Because you remember, Dad is a phenomenally talented linguist. So I want to go to language school. I want you to give me money for college, and then tell me what else you can do, for me. And he's like, well, I can't do anything else for you. I can get you those two. But he said to go to Defense Language Institute in the Navy, you have to go active duty. And I said, well, that ain't not happening. That is not happening. Until I finish college, I'm not going to consider going active duty. And so I toddled myself off to the Army Reserve recruiter. And I said, DLI, college money, what else are you going to do? And he said, that's all I can. I can get you those two if you qualify, if you pass the tests with high enough scores. I'm like, I was an arrogant little squirt. I said, don't worry about your tests. I'll pass the tests. And I did. I blew them away. I blew them out of the water. And so off I went to the Defense Language Institute, where I found that one of my classmates was, in fact, a Navy reservist. Dude lied to me. My guess is that he knew he couldn't get me into that unit, and so he figured he was going to try to get a different recruiting quota instead. But so he lied to me, and it cost him a recruit. So off I went to spend 18 months getting my initial entry training, a year of language, and then it was 3 or 4 months of specialty training, and then some lap time in the middle until the school's dates didn't line up right. So I had some gap time in between them. So 18 months, earning money, got college credits, got the Army to pay for college equivalency examinations like crazy, because I didn't have to. I was like, it doesn't cost me anything. Let me take the test. Can I pass? I don't know. Doesn't cost me anything. Let's take the test. And I tested out of an entire year of college that way. I got 21 units of language for going to DLI for a year. I got a piddly little bit for basic training and nothing for my advanced individual specialty training. And I started effectively, just counting the number of credits, I started 5 units short of an associate's degree before I ever set foot in a college classroom. And I just never bothered to pay the fees to graduate with the associate's degree, because I figured once I had the bachelor's, who cares? So I ended up about 1 semester behind people who graduated from high school the same time I did. I had a job for 18 months, and I was 1 semester behind my age peers. Plus, I had the GI Bill. Plus, I met Becky at DLI. We got
all I was within the 18 months. Wow. You mentioned about language. So you took what language at the Institute?
Russian.
Russian.
I took Russian.
That's uncommon. Why did you?
Yes. Yeah. Well, the way it works is you go to the Military Enlistment Processing Station, and they tell you what jobs are available, and if you get a language job, what languages are available. And if you're in the reserve, you have to go into a job that's available in a unit that's close enough for you to participate on weekend drills. They usually use 50-mile radius as the working rule. So there has to be a unit within 50 miles that needs that job. And if it's a language job, you have to be in a language that unit needs. The unit I ended up in was a psychological operations company, in other words, propaganda. And it was during the Cold War. And this particular unit was focused on operations in Germany, and the operations planning was all aimed at what they called the Fulda Gap scenario, which was the Soviet Union was going to come rolling through the Fulda Gap in massive force, and then the U.S. forces that were already in Germany were going to try to hold them, and then deploy massive forces from the U.S. That was the strategic operations plan that this unit's mission was built into. So what did they need? They needed people who spoke Russian to do propaganda aimed at the Soviets who came through the Fulda Gap. So the first thing they offered me was Korean, actually. Oh. I have no idea what this unit had anything to do with Korean, but they offered me Korean first. Mm-hmm. And I said, maybe it was maybe they would have put me in a different unit.
Right.
If I had taken Korean. Mm-hmm. But I had been told, and I believed it, that Korean was one of the most difficult languages for native speakers of English to learn. And it is. And so I said, no, I don't want anything that's quite that difficult. I really want German. Mm-hmm. because at the time, if you had an active duty career in the Army, you were virtually guaranteed to do a tour in Germany. Mm-hmm. And I thought that would be a blast to do a tour in a country where I actually spoke the language.
Okay.
So I said, no, I don't want Korean. I really want German. And they said, well, we can't do German. You can take Korean, or the only other language we can offer you is Russian. Well, guess what? Russian is in a difficulty class. It's exactly the same difficulty class as Korean.
Oh, you just didn't know it.
I didn't know it. I didn't know that. I thought, well, it's an Eastern European language. It's European. It's probably got more similarities to English than Korean does. It doesn't.
Yeah.
It doesn't.
Misconceptions.
It's as difficult, and it didn't give me any trouble at all, and I wouldn't have had any trouble with Korean.
Yeah.
Now, so then ask me, have I ever been stationed in Germany? Would it have done me any good to speak German? No. Guess where I've been stationed? Korea. But I turned it down. I turned down the language. I would have had a blast. I was in Munsan. You were in Shanghai. You were in Shanghai at the time.
We're talking about Korean and Russian, but I'm sorry, Chinese is I feel like the most difficult language to learn. But you learned Russian, and did you actually use it quite a bit then in your work?
No, actually, I used it very, very little. Because as soon as I finished the job training, I came back to California and started college, and I signed up as an ROTC cadet, and I was training with the same unit. But of course, most of what we did was in English, and unless we were actually training on actual, all the administrative stuff was in English. But when we were doing training, we would do targeted language propaganda. But that was a very tiny portion of what we did.
Oh, I see.
And then when I went on active duty, here I am again making inaccurate assumptions about things and making life choices based on those decisions or that information. So when I graduated, or as I was coming up on graduation, they said, well, what branch within the Army do you want to go into? And I said, well, I'll do military intelligence. PSYOPs at the time was part of the military intelligence branch. It isn't anymore. And the language, I was like, most of the linguists are in the military intelligence branch. If I want to use my language skills, but it'd be best to stay in military intelligence. No problem. They picked me up for military intelligence, commissioned me. I went on active duty after I graduated. And that was when I discovered most of the linguists are in the military intelligence branch, but they're not officers.
Oh, why is that?
They're enlisted because of the kind of work that they do. They're radio intercept operators. They're interrogators. They're intelligence gatherers. They're the operators. They're not the planners and leaders and top level leaders. So the linguists in military intelligence are almost all enlisted. Mm-hmm. Guess what officers get to be linguists? Infantry, armor, field artillery, aviation, combat arms guys. Why? Mm-hmm. Because those are the guys that get assigned as military attaches and foreign area officers dealing with their allies.
Okay.
And so combat arms guys get to be linguists as officers. Intelligence officers typically don't. The only
Okay.
assignment I ever had that was close to a language job was when I was a first lieutenant. I was the platoon leader of a platoon of interrogators, and
Oh,
the platoon leader job was not coded as a language job, but the interrogators were linguists, and about half of
oh,
them spoke Russian, and about half of them spoke Arabic.
okay.
So I would do my Russian language training with the enlisted Russian linguists just to
Hmm.
stay brushed up on it. And the
Hmm.
command let me do that, even though the language stuff wasn't technically part of my job, because they thought it was a good example for the junior soldiers to see me maintaining my skills and studying to maintain my skills.
Hmm.
Every now and then, I would decide I was having a bad day, and anybody who came into my office, if he didn't speak Russian, wasn't going to get anything done unless he would go get one of the Russian speaking soldiers to be an interpreter. I didn't do that
What?
very often, but yeah, well, if you think about it, it was good training for the soldiers,
Mm.
right? Because those who spoke Russian would practice their skills with me, and I'd get to practice mine. The ones who didn't speak Russian, one of the things interrogators have to know how to do is how to work with an interpreter and how to work as an interpreter.
Hmm.
Those are required job skills. So they would have to bring in a Russian guy Russian speaker who would have to work as an interpreter, and the other guy would have to work with the interpreter, trying to speak English, but I wouldn't answer him until the question came to me through the Russian. I didn't do that very often, but every now and then I'm just like, I feel like being weird today, and so I would.
Yeah, yeah.
So I was, in addition to being platoon leader, I was also the executive officer. I was the second ranking officer in the company, and so it wasn't like they could go around me or over my head.
How long then did you stay with this position? Because you became a chaplain. So how did that come about?
Of course, that wasn't just like a sudden decision. The whole call to ministry thing had been building up over time. Started actually in high
Okay.
school. In high school, one of the guidance counselors asked me whether I was planning to
Hmm.
go into ministry. She knew I was a person of faith,
Hmm.
yeah, but she asked me whether I was planning to go into ministry, and I said no, not really planning on it. Nope. She said, "Why not?" She said, I think you would be
Hmm.
good at it." And I told her, "Well, it's not the kind of thing you should do because you think you'd be good at it, is it? It's the kind of thing you should do because you have a calling. Because if you do it because you think you'd be good at it, you're going to burn out and you're going to hurt a lot of people along the way." So I said, "I'm not going to preclude the possibility it might happen someday. But right now, I don't feel a
Hmm.
calling, and so I don't plan on doing that." Later on, of course, looking back at it, I was like, well, that's part of the call process when people start telling you you'd be good at something.
Messages, right?
That's
Yeah.
one of the messages. But the other thing is that I'm a bit thick headed. And when I think I have a course of action, it may take quite a while to change it.
Really?
Yeah. So I think God kind of had to start working on me and then let it soak in, right, for a while. So then while I was in college, I was active in a Methodist church in Elk Grove, the same one that mom and dad attended. And they had a local church lay speaker program where they would train lay people to lead worship services up to the limit of what required the authority of an ordained minister, to preach and to take other kinds of leadership in the congregation. And right before I went on active duty, I was like, you know what, I'm going to do this. It's interesting to me, and I can make myself useful in the congregation in new ways. So I'm going to do this. So I got the training, and I didn't preach but one or two sermons. It was funny. So like my first sermon was something like 7.5 minutes long, and I didn't realize how short it was going to be until I delivered it, because I had no real experience in public speaking at that point. Um, it was okay sermon, but it was super short. but anyway, so then I went on active duty, and I continued to function in the churches where I was as a local church lay speaker. Would preach occasionally, not often, but would preach occasionally. Covered a couple of worship services for pastors that had to be away for a while, and I was like, you know what, this is fun. It's just fun, and people told me I was good at it.
What was fun about it? To speak, or
I liked the speaking, and found out that I was good at it, and people told me I was good at it, and I liked the teaching aspect of it. I don't think I really at that point understood the pastoral care aspect of professional ministry. That came later. And I have a rather unique style, I have to say. I kind of a unique style on that one. Sometimes people are kind of astonished at some of the things I say and do in the process of pastoral care. But then again, I was ministering to a unique group of people. It was in the military, or it was veterans. And so they don't necessarily interact the way civilians do. So yeah, I would kind of shock people sometimes, the way I did things, but it was always, they understood that it was because I was joining them in their life experience. That's not your stereotypical background. I was expecting to be deployed to Desert Shield. I was in a unit at Fort Hood, Texas. Other units from Fort Hood.
What is Desert Shield? For people that might not know.
Desert Shield and Desert Storm were the U.S. military response to the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait.
Okay.
The Desert Shield was when we went in and we set up the bases, and we just bombed the heck out of everything that Iraq had, but we didn't set foot in Iraq during Desert Shield. We defended Kuwait, and we shot down the missiles that Iraq was shooting toward Kuwait. Desert Storm was when we changed to the more aggressive approach. We had seriously depleted their capability to fight at that point. And so when we switched over to Desert Storm, was the actual aggressive part of driving them out of Kuwait. And this would have been late in Desert Shield, before the transition to Desert Storm. And Desert Storm was amazingly short because of the prep time that we had spent in Desert Shield.
All right. So you just talked about so much about U.S. bombing the heck out of what was happening at this time.
Iraq.
Okay, so Iraq, and was this after 9/11? I don't know. Was it related to anything to 9/11?
Not at all. Well before that. Saddam Hussein, who was a very belligerent, very aggressive leader, had invaded Kuwait because he wanted to seize their oil fields. Kuwait has a very small population, a lot of empty land, and a lot of very rich oil fields. And he had invaded Kuwait because he wanted to seize their oil fields. And but we had a treaty. We had a legal obligation to defend Kuwait. We had been allies with Kuwait for a very, very long time. Before then, they were one of our earliest allies, and so we had legal obligations to protect them, to help them defend themselves. So he rolled in massive force. And the United States deployed to the countries around Kuwait, and to the territory that he hadn't managed to occupy in Kuwait. And the initial focus was to destroy his capability to conduct war.
You ended up being deployed?
I did not, but I thought I would. And the unit I expected to go to didn't have a chaplain, because it was too small. In the Army, most units don't get a chaplain unless they have 500 people or more. Military intelligence battalions are small. They weren't big enough to get their own chaplain, and so they would be covered by a chaplain who was in a nearby unit or a higher headquarters, but they wouldn't get their own. And so I thought, well, gosh, I want to go to this military intelligence battalion. I know they don't have a chaplain. I can work with the chaplain who's assigned to cover them and sort of extend his abilities by leading worship services. So I pursued the licensed local pastor program, thinking in a very situation specific that I can be useful if I get deployed, with the ability to lead worship services and celebrate sacraments. And then I discovered that my plan wouldn't work because licensed local pastors are only appointed to local churches, never to any other kind of ministry. They don't make them chaplains. They don't make them anything other than local church pastors. And so, but I had already started the program by the time I found that out. And I was intrigued by what I was learning and about myself and about pastoral ministry, and was kind of excited about what I was doing. I was like, hey, I could do this for a living, man. not just a side hobby, not just to be helpful. I could do this for a living and enjoy it. So I had my company command. I got out. I started seminary in Ohio. And that's when I learned about the Charismatic Episcopal Church. I was getting more and more uncomfortable with the theology and the practices in the Methodist Church. And so I learned about the Charismatic Episcopal Church, and I'm like, wow, this place is for me. They're biblically orthodox. They're very conservative. They're very high church, very ceremonial worship style that's very appealing to me. And that has remained a part of my faith life ever since. And so I switched. I was already, so I 1 year into my company command, I resigned from company command. Like, I'm tired. I'm fed up with this. I hate command. and so applied for seminary, and applied to be accepted as a chaplain candidate in the Army Reserve. And so I started seminary, and I went about halfway through, a little less than halfway through seminary, in Ohio. And then because of my academic schedule, I was gone 3 days a week, and Becky was left with the kids. We had 3 kids by then. Becky was left taking care of the kids on her own. And then I would come home, and I wasn't working other than seminary. And so then I would come home, I would take care of the kids, and she was working part-time. So we practically never saw each other.
Right.
And it was one of us taking care of the kids or the other one of us taking care of the kids, and never really the whole family together. Or at least rarely with the whole family ever doing anything together. And she found them very stressful. So we moved to Oregon, where she could get her family to help take care of the kids while I was in school. And we ended up living on my mother-in-law and father-in-law's property while I went to seminary. On the whole, it turned out to be a good move. It was stressful. It was difficult. But on the whole, it turned out to be a good move. I probably graduated seminary faster and with less cost than I would have otherwise had I stayed in Ohio. Not coincidentally, I think this is a God thing. There was exactly one priest in the Charismatic Episcopal Church in the state of Oregon, and he was an Army National Guard chaplain, which meant he could be my supervising priest, helping me prepare for ordination, but he could also help me prepare for chaplaincy. I was like, this is not a coincidence. When I graduated, I went on active duty as a chaplain. I was ordained a priest in the Charismatic Episcopal Church, and went on active duty.
Okay, so as a chaplain in the Army, you had an international assignment, right?
I had one assignment in Korea, unaccompanied, one assignment in Korea, and then 2 deployments to combat zone. Like I said, I spent a year in Korea as an unaccompanied tour, and then after that, I came back from Korea and I went to clinical pastoral education, called CPE. That is the qualifying school for chaplains to be hospital chaplains or confinement facility chaplains. And it also makes you eligible in the Army to be a family life chaplain, marriage and family counseling, if there isn't an actual family life chaplain available. So then I went to Iraq as a hospital chaplain.
Okay, as a hospital. And so were you right there I mean, when things are happening, I mean, in the hospital, people get sick, but in a combat zone, people got injured, right?
People got sick and people got wounded.
Okay.
It was not during the invasion phase. So it wasn't the worst of it, but there were bad times. We were in a base that was in the middle of a city. It was in Mosul. Well, so the hospital divided into two locations. We had one in Tikrit, which was the city where Saddam Hussein was from. And then I was the senior of the two. My subordinate, my assistant hospital chaplain, went with the half that went to Tikrit. And then I was with the main hospital headquarters in Mosul. It was past the initial invasion, so it wasn't the worst of the worst. But there were times it was bad. And there were a few mass casualty events while we were there, which means essentially the capacity of the hospital is overwhelmed by the number and severity of the injuries that are happening. So we have to triage and schedule who gets treated in what order. That's pretty much the definition of a mass casualty. We don't have the resources to treat them all at once. So we have to triage them and decide what order to treat them in. And mostly I think I coped with it pretty well, but there were some rough days. One of my stories out of that, probably the worst, and I don't know why it was the worst, because it wasn't the most horrific thing that I saw. So there was a Turkish contractor who was supporting the U.S. forces on the base in Mosul, had a heart attack while we were there. He wasn't a combat injury. He had a heart attack. This guy in his 50s or 60s, and they brought him in through our trauma bay, through our ER. And the staff were, the background behind this too was we had 2 deaths in the hospital already that week. And one of them was someone who was known to several of the staff. Somebody who was a personal friend of several of members of the staff. So this guy comes in, this Turkish contractor is not a U.S. soldier, not one of our allied soldiers, civilian guy. And he's having a heart attack. And they put him in the emergency room, and they're doing CPR on him, and they're trying to electroshock, start his heart. And one of the doctors, it's like you see on the TV shows, and one of the doctors gets up on the gurney and is doing CPR on him while they roll him off to the ER so they can crack his chest open and put the electric paddles straight on the heart and try open heart massage and everything. And the staff, you could just tell by watching them, they were desperate. They were absolutely desperate. They could not lose one more person that week. They just couldn't accept losing one more person that week. And so, and there was nothing really for me to do with the patient. I would go to the ER when there was a trauma situation and try to get some time to talk with the patients if there was a break in what the medical staff were doing, and I could get their attention. There was no opportunity to try to talk to this guy, nor would he have probably valued it if I had, because he was Turkish. He was presumably Muslim, and I'm not. But there was no opportunity. And so I stood back, I had my stole on. I got in the practice when I went to the emergency room, I would wear my stole, which in the hospital stole is a smaller than usual stole, and it's purple trimmed in white on one side, and the other side is just white. But it's pretty well recognized in hospitals as a signal that this is a chaplain, that's doing ministry stuff. And if there was nothing else for me to do, I would stand where everybody could see me, out of the way, and pray for people. And even though we didn't grow up with rosaries, but I would be praying and use a rosary in my prayers. It would be very visible what I was doing. They went into the ER, and I went and I positioned myself in the scrub room where there was a window. They could see me and I could see them. And I was there, praying for the team. And I was overwhelmed by the desperation. And this was in the evening, and Becky and I had we would get on instant messaging and chat with each other in the evenings, but she knew that when there was a trauma in the hospital, I wouldn't be able to do that. So if I wasn't on, she didn't worry, or at least she told herself not to worry, that there wasn't anything bad happening to me, that I was in the ER dealing with the trauma. It's what she told herself. I don't know how much confidence she had in that. And because we would get mortared, and she knew that. And shot at. But anyway, afterward, and they finally pronounced the guy dead. And I milled around, talked to the staff for a while. And then I went back to my office to see whether I could still get Becky on the computer. And I would chat with the kids, and then they would go to school, and then I would chat with Becky. And so I got online with Becky, and she's like, hey, the kids are just about to leave, but you can talk to them really, really briefly before they have to go to school. Do you want to do that? And I said, no. I am not up to being cheerful for the kids right now. I've had a really hard day. Mm-hmm. And I didn't tell her at the time what the details were.
Yeah.
I said I really, really needed her there to hold me that evening. Really needed her there to hold me that evening. And so she bought a teddy bear. She bought me a teddy bear, and she gave it to all of the kids to hug, and then packaged it up and mailed it to me so that when I needed a hug, I could hold the bear, and know that my family was hugging me.
Aww.
I still have that bear. It's in my bedroom, looking over the bed, looking at me over the bed. Yeah. And there were times for the rest of that deployment when I went to bed with that bear tucked in my arms like a kid, because I needed my family's support. Yeah, as you said, there were some hard days.
I think that most people don't realize, civilians, they know that there's military out there. They know that they have to go to different countries to defend but I think they don't really understand the things that happen abroad. And maybe sometimes they really just take the military for granted,
Unless they're first responders, I don't see how they could possibly understand it.
Right. Right.
So the mass cows, it wasn't the mass cows that really got me. It was the one-on-one incidents like that. Right. That really got to me and really, really took everything I could pull together to deal with.
Yeah. You've been to all these different locations that you mentioned, but I saw some pictures of you in Africa, and that also brought me to the question about, because you adopted a son as well, and I just wanted to know how that came about. And
sometime in 2009, toward the first half of the year, I remember it as being later, but Gordon says it was toward the first half of the year. I got contacted by this total stranger out of the blue, who was looking for a friend of his on Facebook who had a name that was similar to mine. And I can't, when he ran the search, my profile was one of the ones. He never did find his friend, by the way, but my profile was one of the ones that popped up. And he saw the clergy collar, because my profile photo had the priest's collar on. I had the priest shirt with a priest collar on at the time. And so he was intrigued by that, because he's Roman Catholic and he was actually in seminary at the time. And so he looked at my profile, and when he realized I was married, that kind of blew his mind, because he had no experience of priests who were married and have kids. So he reached out and asked me some questions, and I told him about the Charismatic Episcopal Church. He shared with me about his situation. He was beginning to feel that he was in the wrong place, that he was not called to priesthood in the Roman Catholic Church, and was getting uncomfortable with where he was. And I walked with him through some challenging decisions and gave him some pastoral advice. Indeed, he did end up leaving the seminary. The Jesuits, it was a Jesuit seminary. The Jesuits gave him $50 and set him down on the streets of Nairobi with no resources whatsoever. And then when he got there, he was ostracized by his home church for having left the seminary. And he was excommunicated completely without justification. He was excommunicated, and not legally, by the way, not according to canon law. The priest who did it did not have the authority to do so. But that priest from his home parish put out the word to the other parishes in the city that they weren't to serve him Eucharist, and people would shun him. And so I said, well, go see the bishop, go see the Charismatic Episcopal Church bishop, and check out the CEC church in Nairobi. And he did, and he got engaged in that, and he couldn't get a job, couldn't get a job, didn't have the education, didn't have the bribe money, because in Kenya, you can't get a job unless you bribe the hiring manager, and the standard price is 3 months of your pay, expected pay for that position. And he didn't have the bribe money, and he didn't have the education. He couldn't get to jobs. And so I was in contact with him all this time, and praying with him and for him, and counseling him. And somewhere along in there, he said, you know, I've never really had a dad. Do you mind if I call you Dad? Because you've kind of become Dad to me. Understand, we've never seen each other face to face at this point. His dad was killed when he was an infant. His mom died of typhoid when he was 15. He worked for room and board to get through high school, and then some years after high school came to the conclusion he was never going to get an education or a decent job, and that's why he accepted the invitation to the seminary. So he's somewhere along in there started calling me Dad, and I was like, okay, fine, I guess that's all right. I started a scholarship fund, Charismatic Episcopal Church Scholarship Fund, African College Education Fund is what it was called, or the ACE Fund. And initially it was to pay for a college education for him so he could get a job. It hasn't shut down yet, but that was the initial goal. And he had a full ride scholarship, paid for room and board, and even at that, the conditions he was living in were abominable. He showed me a picture of his apartment one time, the first apartment that he got, and it was a 2x4 frame covered with sheet metal. There was no insulation, there was no sheetrock, there was no paint on the thing, there was no heating system, there was no plumbing. It was literally the 2x4 frame covered with sheet metal, and that's what he was paying rent for. It wasn't legal, but in code enforcement in Kenya is not, you bribe the inspectors, they go away and they don't bother you. We moved him up eventually into a better apartment. That place burned down. We had to move him. That place ended up burning down. But the scholarship fund covered his computer, covered a camera, software that he needed for his classes, textbooks he needed for his classes, tuition, transportation to get to school, room and board, up through his associate's degree. So it took him 2.5 years to get that degree. And he still had a heck of a time getting a job. I struggled with it, but I really could not bring myself to let the scholarship fund give him the bribe money to get a job. Now there are Christian ministries that say, you know what, you want to do good in Africa, you got to pay the bribes. You just do it. And, you don't worry about whether it's ethical or whatever, because you're just not going to get anything done if you don't pay the bribes. But I just couldn't bring myself to do that. So he kind of paid the price for that. He languished for quite a while, not able to get a job. He finally did get a job, came to the United States as a journalist working for a Roman Catholic magazine in Eastern Kenya. Okay, so while he was in the States to cover the World Gathering of Families for this Roman Catholic magazine, then he came down to Virginia to attend Naomi's wedding, and he went back. He wasn't able to attend, but he did participate in the reception. We couldn't get him on the base. And so then he went back to Africa, and he announced his candidacy for Parliament, trying to sort of crowdfund his campaign. as a member of the opposition party, not the major party in power. And there were a couple of attempts to assassinate him that apparently were politically driven.
Oh, really?
And because he was, anti-government corruption was his thing. And so he came back to the United States. His visa was still valid, that he had come with in the first place was still valid. There was no limit to the number of times he could enter the U.S., but it was just like 2 year. He had a 2-year window to come. So he came as a tourist, intending to ask for political asylum once he was here. So to get political asylum, you have to be in the United States when you apply for it. Somehow you have to get to the U.S. Legal, illegal, whatever. You have to get to the U.S. to apply for political asylum. So he did, applied for political asylum and stayed with me. And I took care of him for 6 months until he could get his work permit. And then once he had his work permit, he went to work like crazy. He was holding down 3 jobs. He was working hard. He wanted to put away some money and finish his bachelor's degree, which eventually he did. And in the process, he married a woman who was a doctoral candidate at the University of Oregon in literature. And she has finished her doctorate now. And they now live in Washington State, up in the Seattle area, where he works for the county. He's working on his master's degree now. And he's launched a nonprofit organization called Angels of Africa, doing essentially trying to social uplift kind of stuff. They raised $30,000 to put in a well in his home village. They've planted like hundreds of avocado trees that will produce crops that they are both nutrition for this nutritionally deficient population and possible moneymakers. Just all kinds of, he's doing all kinds of things. And as a VA chaplain, I discovered that Oregon is one of the states where it's still legal to adopt an adult. And so, so I talked to Becky about it.
Why did you feel you had to adopt him? He was already an adult there, working hard, getting things done.
This is a little silly, perhaps. It's symbolic. It's symbolic more than real, in some ways, because adopting him isn't going to raise. I'm not going to raise him. It's not going to be the parent that was there for his whole childhood or anything. But he'd been calling me dad for years. He'd been calling Becky mom for years. He was calling our mom and dad grandma and granddad, and Becky's mom and dad, grandma and grandpa, for years. And he was actively engaged in our family life, and he would introduce us to people as his family, and he called me dad. And I was just like, you know what, we need to make this. First of all, I'm a little bit rule bound, and for me, without that adoption, it was a little awkward telling people this is my son, and he's calling me dad, and I always felt like I had to explain it. That was part of it, was just to become comfortable with being called mom and dad and son and so on, and referring to his wife Robin as my daughter-in-law, and so that was part of it. Part of it was because we decided, we want to make him part of our family. I contacted Denise and John and Naomi, and I said, hey, do you guys have any objection to this? You understand that this will make him full member of the family, and that he will inherit 25% of my estate, just like each of you kids will. You would have gotten 30% each, and now you're going to get 25, and he's going to get 25. Yeah. Because he will be my son in every legal sense, just like, we kind of morally kind of already were, at that point. And so they're like, yeah, and this was all before I talked to Gordon about it. I wanted to make sure it was okay with my kids and with Becky before I talked to Gordon about it. Becky was nervous, not because the idea of adopting him bothered her, but because she was afraid it would screw up his immigration status. She kind of wanted to wait until he was naturalized. And but I looked into it, and the adoption attorney said it's not going to be a problem. Becky was concerned that because when you get adopted, you get a new birth certificate. In Oregon, they'd issue you a new birth certificate with your adoptive parents listed as your parents on the birth certificate. And so she was afraid that would screw up the record keeping and confuse immigration. But the adoption attorney said, no, that's not a problem. The state of Oregon has dealt with this many times. They give you a birth certificate and written right across the top, like not valid for citizenship purposes, adoption of a foreign national. And so it didn't cause any trouble at all. And he is now naturalized. So we adopted him, and I joke about it, and I tell people, yeah, you can always tell when the family gathers which one is adopted because he's so much taller than the rest of us.
So thanks a lot, Jonathan, for coming and sharing your story with us today. And thank you for joining us on this podcast. And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye. It's been an honor.